Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated, and if you would, please open a Bible to Esther 2. And while you're getting there, I want to briefly recap why we're looking at Esther, how we're approaching this book, and where we've been so far. And so first, why Esther? As we talked about last week, it's a strange book, one that Christians seem to have no idea what to do with. It seems on the one hand very historical, but there are all kinds of hints and clues that suggest that that is not how it's meant to be read. Instead, it just might be, given how brilliantly, literarily it's shaped, this book might just be God's using a general historical context, his people in exile, in diaspora, in the Persian Empire, mainly just to tell a good story. A good story about his faithfulness to his people, even when it seems like he's nowhere to be seen. A point made all the more resonant by the fact that God is not mentioned at all in this book. And we also talked about that God not only seems to be telling us there's a good story here about his faithfulness and his absence, but it's a funny story to boot. And that despite the fact, or perhaps all the more impressive because of the fact that this is a story about the threat of genocide, right? The extermination of the Jewish people living in the Persian Empire, which would seem to be anything but funny given recent history. And yet, that might be part of the point. The characters in the story going through this existential threat, they might be fearful in this story. They might have tough decisions to make in which they don't know how things are going to turn out. But we, the readers, we can laugh. We can laugh at the absurdity, at all the ridiculousness of the story, the absurdity that there is any such thing as a real threat to God's good purposes. Because we know the ending. And more than that, we know the author. And in a sense, the story reminds us that one day we will be able to laugh at our own stories too. And can even do so now on this side of things. Paul says, rejoice always. We can even do so on this side of things, all because we know that our future good ending, because of our eternal good God, is seen most fully in the knowledge of what he has done for us in his Son, Jesus Christ, through the cross. But we get ahead of ourselves. Last week, we looked at the particular picture of absurdity that chapter 1 paints for us. The absurd world of our story, this absurd world of the Persian king and his weird court, the absurd world that God's people in our story not only have to live in, but somehow actually have to overcome in our story. And it's a world that's far removed from the promised land. It's a world instead of enormous wealth and power, a world literally drunk on that wealth and power, that 187-day party that the king sponsors. Intensely decadent, intensely selfish, and above all, as we find out, intensely shallow. And you might remember that this chapter begins by introducing King Ahasuerus, who rules over 127 provinces, from Ethiopia all the way to India. And yet the point is, by the end of the chapter, the king and his court worry that maybe they don't even rule over their own wives and households. That's the end of chapter 1. And all because of the fact that the queen does not come to the king's drunken free-for-all when she is beckoned. And for fear that the other wives might all go rogue too, the court convinces the king to dismiss his wife and queen, which brings us to our reading, this twisted beauty contest to find the king a new queen. And so what I want to do this morning is fairly simple. Look at this beauty contest, its origins, what spurs it, look at how it's run, and then look at our title character, Esther, and what her going through this beauty contest is actually a picture of. And not to give away the store, but in short, she's a picture of God's people in the world, of Israel, of Christ, of the church, of you and me. And we'll touch on Mordecai briefly, but mainly just to understand Esther, we'll have to focus on him and the foiled assassination next week in chapter 3. So let's dig in and start with the situation of the king after the events of chapter 1, verse 1. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed, note by him, against her. So in other words, after a period of time, without a wife, without a queen, right? We're not told how long, And if you do the math, it seems something on the order of 2 to 3 years after telling Vashti not to let the door hit her on the way out. But the feel of things, forgetting the math, the feel of things is more like it's the immediate aftermath, the day after, if you will, of that 187-day party from chapter 1, day 188, as it were. We're told that after the king's anger had abated, in other words, after he sobered up, right? And maybe you've been there. You had a few drinks, and before you know it, you're like, you never loved me. You never even loved my dog. I'm leaving you. And then in the morning, you wake up with a raging headache and fuzzy memories and think, oopsies. That seems to be the situation of the king at the beginning of chapter 2. He remembered Vashti and what he had done and what he had decreed against her. And the thing is, he's not worried he's going to be, how shall we put it, lonely, if you know what I mean, right? He's the king. He's got a harem. He's going to be okay in that particular department. Rather, if you recall in chapter 1, the point is that he had been boasting about her and bringing her to the party because of what a hottie she is, right? And so what's at stake for him, for this guy, the richest, most powerful man in all the world who holds 187-day parties and drinks out of golden cups, all the while reclining on golden couches, what's at stake for him is that he no longer possesses the most beautiful woman in the world. He's a bit like Tom Brady, right? Although I'm not going to go into that because he might be watching on the live stream, right? And you see, this is a problem for a guy who clearly needs to feel important. And his advisors, verse 2, are presumably worried that the king might go out and, do something silly, like buy a flaming red muscle car, or take up skydiving or something, to compensate for a sense of inadequacy, right? And so they have an idea, which is good because they're paid to have ideas. So about halfway through verse 2, they say, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, right? And he did so, right? Once again, we see here the Persian court doing what it does best, overreacting and overreaching, right? When the queen refused to come at the king's drunken command, the court saw that as a threat to all the husbands in the kingdom. Now the king needs a new queen, so they decide to gather, basically incarcerate all the available beautiful young women of the entire kingdom. Because that's probably a measured, reasonable response to the king's insecurity. And of course, the reason they need to lock up all those women for a year is so that they can undergo the mother of all makeovers, right? Skip all the way down to verse 12. The virgins only get to visit the king, when we'll get to that. They can only visit the king after verse 12, being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was a regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments. Now again, obviously, this is absurd. This is over the top, and yet it reflects everything we've learned so far about the Persian court and its superficiality. The king, at least his court presumes, isn't interested in natural beauty. What he needs is literally man-made beauty. And if that seems sexist, it is. But it's also more than that. From the perspective of Torah, from the perspective of the Pentateuch, the law, specifically Genesis, specifically the idea of human beings, male and female, in the image of God, in the blessings of God to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, in Torah's understanding that human sexuality is divinely intended, divinely purposed, right? And that not only in terms of the created order, right, but also in the economy of salvation. That follows after the fall in Genesis. That salvation happens through generations, through a history of generations of humanity. In the understanding of all that, whatever is going on here is a gross distortion of divinely intended purposes. Something fundamentally dehumanizing, a distortion of our divinely imaged humanity. And it's all for the pleasure and for the vanity of this insecure human king. And the nadir, the lowest point of this dehumanizing contest, is, of course, the one-night audition with the king, and what follows for each woman out of that. Each woman, after that year of beautifying, visits the king for an evening, verse 14, and then in the morning is transferred to another harem, right, wherein presumably she will remain for the rest of her life as a concubine now to the king. Unless she turns out to be, as the rules of the contest go, the one woman whom the king calls by name to return to his glorious presence. All the rest are used and tossed aside. But the thing is, it's not just dehumanizing to the women, because even if by worldly standards the king kind of gets the better end of things, the king too is no less dehumanized in this process, in this picture of the absurd bureaucracy of the Persian court, wherein even the king's sex life is part of this bureaucratic machine, which, granted, is not unusual for royalty, where when one needs to guarantee the integrity of the succession, the stability of the state and all that, but still, this degree of it, this insane contest involving all the young unmarried women of the empire, it's absurd and absurdly degrading and absurdly dehumanizing. But the point is, as you look at this, the point is not to be morally offended by what's happening here. The gall of these Persians back then to treat women like this, it's just wrong by all 21st century standards. No, that's not the point. History is not the point. Morality here is not the point. Rather, the Persian court is set up here as a picture of the world, a world without the knowledge of God, a world therefore governed by pagan, ungodly, unbiblical values, a world that you and I also probably know, a world that you and I also increasingly as Christians find ourselves living in. The details and specifics may be different, although frankly, maybe not so much all that much these days. And yet the point is, in this story, and for us in our stories, that this is the world wherein God's people are called to live, wherein God's people must be and will be who they are meant to be, namely God's people in the world, a light in the world, a light in what is otherwise darkness. And that is who Esther is in our story in chapter 2. Now, as I mentioned, I want to get back to Mordecai in more detail next week, but there's one thing we need to know about him here in order to understand Esther, in order to understand the context for reading her character in chapter 2. So let's look at him briefly. Verse 5. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, lots to talk about there next week. But for now, the key thing to note is the context of exile that verse 6 hammers away at. Mordecai is identified here as belonging to the first group of exiles brought to Babylon from Jerusalem in 597 BC. There's another group in 586. This is the first group. In other words, this guy's the real deal. This guy was there during that first siege. This guy is one who remembers Jerusalem. This guy has lived through the entire experience of exile. But for our purposes with Esther, that's not actually what's critical. So bookmark here for a second the idea of exile. Bookmark it in the back of your heads. And now let's look at how Esther is introduced. Verse 7. He, that's Mordecai, was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay, beside the fact that Esther has a Hebrew name and a Gentile name, we are given here two key bits of information about Esther. First, and we're given this twice just to make sure we notice, she is an orphan. She has neither father nor mother, for they both have died. Now, at one point, it's a plot point, right? The story's got to explain why she's living with her cousin. Or does it? I mean, plot-wise, the story could work fine if Mordecai's her father, or if there's some other kind of arrangement. You could make it work if you're a creative author. In other words, what's important in one, her being an orphan, and two, Mordecai's bringing her up, or literally being her guardian, what's important is that it tells us exactly who Esther is. Namely, that she is an orphaned daughter being raised, in a sense, by exile. Or to be more blunt, she's the orphaned daughter of exile. She is, in other words, a stand-in, orphaned, and a stand-in for orphaned and exiled daughter Zion, orphaned and exiled Israel. Orphaned, not just in the plot line, but in this world, a world where God seems absent in the past 2 chapters and for the rest of the book in some ways. And symbolically, in this book where God is not even mentioned once. And exiled because, well, look again at verse 6, that description of Mordecai, the context of her upbringing. Verse 6 repeats the Hebrew word root for the word for exile 4 times in one verse. It's a little hard to see in English, but where you see carried away, captives, carried away again, those are all coming from the same Hebrew root, galah, which means to go into exile. And so it's a bit like a flashing Hebrew neon sign saying, hey, you need to read whatever's going on here in the context of exile, in case you weren't noticing, right? Of what it means. You have to read whatever's going on here in terms of what it means for Israel, what it means for God's people to have gone through exile, to be in exile. So that's the first thing that we get out of verse 7 with a little bit of digging around. That Esther is, in this tale, Israel, orphaned, exiled, daughter Zion. The second thing we learn from verse 7 is that she is beautiful. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Now, once again, it's all too easy to write that off as just a plot point, a sexist detail in a lurid sexist story. The king is looking for a beautiful queen that he can show off to the world. And Esther here is being set up as just the woman with that hourglass figure for the job. But the ESV's translation is just a little bit misleading, although it's understandable. What the ESV is trying to do is to colloquialize the Hebrew, which is literally, and the young girl was beautiful of form, toar in Hebrew, and pleasing or good to look at. Now that word toar, form, is not uncommon. Rachel in Genesis is beautiful in form. Same phrase. So is Joseph in Genesis. So also are the cows in the dream that Pharaoh describes to Joseph. to each his own, right? Anyway. But there's also one who is described specifically as not being beautiful in form, in toar, namely the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. This is Isaiah 53:2. For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form, toar, or majesty, that we should look at him, and no beauty, that we should desire him. But the thing is, in Isaiah, that appearance to everyone around the servant is not actually the reality. It's just how we, with our eyes closed and our hearts hardened, perceive the servant on our own. That he had no form, that we should look at him, that he had no beauty, that we should desire him. Now, that servant, that suffering servant, is, like Esther here, Israel as well. And ultimately, that Israel is most fully seen in Christ on the cross, whose form to the self-wise is repulsive, whose majesty to the self-righteous is non-existent, who has no beauty there that the world could desire. But as St. Paul tells us, the cross, Israel, as the suffering servant, is only ever folly and shame and ugliness to those who are perishing. But in reality, in truth, and to those who are called, to those being saved, those who can actually see, the cross is wisdom. The cross is good. The cross is beautiful. The form, the toar of the beautiful of God when it comes into contact with this world. And Esther, orphaned, exiled, daughter Zion, daughter Israel, without father or mother in the world, is beautiful in form, to God above all else, but also as the story unfolds, even to the world which does not know, as with the suffering servant, who it is looking at. In other words, the end game of this beauty contest is that the truth of her beauty, the beauty of God's people, even orphaned and exiled, maybe even especially orphaned and exiled, is made evident to this messed up, absurd world as that world recognizes that there just seems to be something special about her. From the outset, she wins the favor of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the concubines. And the subtext there is, she doesn't really need any of that beautifying to win people over. She has the favor of those around her, and she gets an entourage to boot, seemingly well before that year, maybe even 6 months, the first 6 months of beautifying is even done. And the reason for this, figurally speaking, the reason why orphaned, exiled Israel is beautiful, even to the world who might not understand why the world thinks so. The reason comes out in a seemingly innocuous aside at the beginning of the climactic moment of the story in verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the sight of all who saw her. Now, before we say anything, if this scene makes you uncomfortable, right, the idea of Esther, right, the heroine of the story, auditioning with the king, you're in good company. The early rabbis were deeply uncomfortable with everything going on here. But again, the point is not to read this historically in terms of what might have actually historically happened. And the point is not to read this morally in terms of what should have happened, legally, morally. The point is to read it figurally in terms of what is figurally happening to Esther as this orphaned, exiled daughter Zion. And what is happening is a figural moment of going down into degradation, into humiliation at the hands of the nations. It's an echo of Jerusalem falling into the hands of the Babylonians. It's a picture even of the cross, Christ's submission of his body to the power and abuses of the nations. And yet, notice this. It's almost like an afterthought. Right after the story announces that Esther's turn for humiliation has come, the story gives Esther the genealogy it seemed to have forgotten earlier. Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai. That's intentional, right? That timing is intentional, right? Telling us that now. Withholding her father's name for us until this moment, until she is going down into the figural pit. Because the name of her father, Abihail, means my father is my strength. My father is strength. And that hope, that truth, that the father is your strength, is the hope of daughter Zion. It's the hope of Israel. It's the hope of God's people in all times and in all places, whether in the land or outside the land, or even in the going down into the suffering and shame of exile and death. Our hope always lies in the truth that our Father is our strength, always and everywhere. And the thing is, it is that hope, even in the suffering and shame, even in the hurt and humiliation, it is that hope that makes the form of God's people beautiful to behold. To all the world, even if they don't know why, even if they don't understand how, even if they are the cause of the suffering and the hurt. And that is the truth of the church, that the church is beautiful, and with a beauty not of her own making, but with a beauty forged by God, and forged precisely in our being poured out to the world, for the good of the world, because the church is God's hand at work in the world. And so the church is, God's people are never more beautiful than when she is like Esther, than when she is like Christ, than when she stretches out her arms of love, ultimately God's love, on the hardwood of the cross, drawing the world to herself in that beauty and to the Father who is her strength. And that beauty, in case it's not yet clear, is a death resurrection beauty. It's a cross-shaped beauty. Notice the previous seemingly procedural language up in verse 14. In the evening, the young woman would go in, and in the morning she would return. And sure, it's another plot point, but it's also echoing the language of the days in the creation account in Genesis 1. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day, and the second day, and the third day. In other words, for Esther too, for orphaned exiled daughter Zion, for Israel, for God's people, because of the God who has predestined her, who has created her, who has elected her, and who is with her and leading her every step of the way, there may be evening, darkness, the Sheol of exile, but there is always morning, the light of God's faithfulness, the light of a new day, the light of a new creation. And how can Israel know this? How can we know this? Well, because of God, because of the all-glorious King who guarantees it by who he is. And we get a glimpse, a very brief glimpse, of who he is and who he is for us as the reality of the one true King slips through the cracks of his parody, of his farcical imitation in the picture we have in chapter 2 of this vain Persian king. Look finally at verse 16. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor, a chesed, in his sight, more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. And as always, this is part of the plot too. The Persian king needs to love Esther so that the action that's coming can have a happily ever after ending. But in this picture of a king who loves Esther, a king who has loved this orphan but beautiful daughter of Israel, and more, if you'll pardon my bluntness, who loves her not as the eunuchs do, not as the women do, that is with admiration or respect, but who loves her and finds her beautiful as a man, right? That is desirously, possessively, jealously even, choosing her as his own, forsaking all others. Well, albeit in very inadequate and very human terms, that is a picture of God's love for his people, a picture of the fact that God finds his people beautiful and passionately so, that God finds you, that God finds me lovely, desirable, worth fighting for, even when in worldly terms we may be anything but, even when we look in the mirror and we feel anything but. But the gospel truth is the King has chosen us without cosmetics, seeming warts and all, because this King doesn't operate with our idea of beauty. And more, he doesn't simply love what is beautiful. He makes beautiful what he loves. He makes beautiful who he loves. Those whom he has always loved since the foundation of the world, those he simply loves into loveliness. And that love of the King for you and the lengths he will go to claim and to hold on to what he wants, who he wants, the picture of that is the cross. And that cross not only makes you his, claims you as his forever, it makes you lovely. And not with cosmetics, not with the things the world thinks makes us lovely, but rather through our own crosses. And all so that we can learn for ourselves and thereby declare for the world, to the world, with our very lives, that truth that makes God's people beautiful, that truth that the Father is our strength. And so to him be all the glory forever and ever. Amen.